Hi everyone, welcome to the talk today. If you haven't met me before, my name is Indy. I'm a second year studying Maths and Computer Science at Adelaide Uni. And I'm also part of the Evangelical Students, which is a Christian club who is hosting this event today. Thank you all for coming along. I hope you've been made to feel really welcome and that you really enjoy your time here with us today. Today we are going to hear a talk which is titled I Find Hope in Sex and Relationships. It's said to be a really interesting and thought-provoking topic today. I hope this topic will get you thinking and start some really great discussions as well. This talk is actually part of a series that we're doing all week and looking at what we find hope in this world. So now I'm going to invite Ben to come up, who is our speaker, and we're going to meet him. So, hi Ben, you're the pastor at St Barnabas in Croydon, and you've got a lovely wife and 4 kids. We heard yesterday you studied engineering and worked as an engineer for a while in the UK and before you came over here. So, what is something that you miss about home in the UK and something that you enjoy about Adelaide that might be different?
Indy did warn me she was going to ask me that question, and I completely forgot to think about it. Something that I think I miss most relationships with people in the UK, people that I grew up with, people that I've invested time in, and I think I would say to you, you haven't asked me this, but your time at university is really unique as an opportunity to invest in friendships, and I kind of naively thought that after university I'd be able to continue to get to know new people at every phase of life, and it gets harder as you go on in life because you get busy with work and family and other things. So the relationships that you're building now are really precious, and I miss friends. One thing that is good about Adelaide, I love Adelaide. My family, we lived in London in the UK, and moving to Adelaide is a big change, and almost every change is positive. Adelaide is warmer, quieter, easier to get around, feels safer. With a young family, those are all really positive things.
Cool. Second question, on the topic of today's talk, relationships, what is some of the best or worst relationship advice you've ever received?
I'm not sure I can't remember receiving much relationship advice at all. This is off the top of my head, so it's not going to be particularly profound. Okay, worst advice. Admitting you're wrong is a sign of weakness. Best advice. Find someone who's kind and shares the same core values as you.
Sounds like some good advice, so thanks Ben, you can take a seat now. We're now going to have the Bible read to us. One of our student leaders at ES is going to come up and do that for us. So the passage we're looking at today is Mark chapter 10, verse 1 to 9. So all of the talks this week are based in the book of Mark. So you should all have a copy of Mark's Gospel on your seats. If you have a red book, please open to page 33. If you have a green book, please open to page 37. There'll be a big number 10 on the page, that's chapter 10, and then we're starting at verse 1. So thanks, Grace.
Cool, so Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 9. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate."
Thanks a lot, Grace. Thanks for coming, especially if you came yesterday. Thanks for coming back. Let me say I'm nervous about giving this talk. I'm nervous for 3 reasons. Firstly, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in my understanding, and I'm certainly not an expert in my practice. This is an area of life in which I failed. Much of my sexual past I regret, and I'm still very conscious of my ongoing imperfections. So I don't speak to you today as someone who's got this area of life all sorted out. I'm a fellow struggler like you. Secondly, I'm nervous because the Christian sexual ethic is increasingly out of step with the views of contemporary culture. Surveys today suggest that the biggest obstacle for people to the Christian faith is the Bible's teaching on sexuality. So I'm conscious of that. Christian views today are not seen as, they're not just seen as outdated, they're seen as repressive and bigoted. It is worth saying that the church historically has not done a good job of presenting a positive view of sexuality. The sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s was largely a reaction, I think, to the church's dysfunctional attitudes. Sadly, the church has often given the impression that sex is a shameful thing, something dirty, only to be engaged in if completely necessary. Often what the church has said about sex has been entirely negative. We've highlighted the dangers of sex without communicating the positive and beautiful picture that the Bible contains. Thirdly, I'm nervous about this talk because, if you hadn't realised, our culture is obsessed with sex and sexual romantic love. Contemporary culture puts more emphasis on sex than any other culture in history. Sex is used in our culture to sell everything from clothes to cars to perfume to water. We talk about it, we think about it, apparently every 7 seconds if you're a guy. We put our hope in it. Can I just say, I don't know if Alan's here, but thank you for your testimony. And Alan spoke of that, didn't he? In his past, putting his hope in sex and relationships. The revolution of the 60s and 70s called for sexual liberation. Fulfillment would be found, we were told, when we embraced the freedom to have sex with whoever, however, whenever we like. A recent BBC article that I read online suggested that the sexual revolution has not gone far enough. It needs to go further. Why does sex need to be connected to love at all? It asked. It should be something that is purely about physical enjoyment. But while that approach has found traction with some, this sexual freedom, there seems to be a growing acknowledgement of some of the damage and limitations of this sexual freedom. The effects of porn and porn addiction, the breakdown of families and its effect on children, and the Me Too movement are all cited as examples. In addition, few who have embraced this sexual freedom seem to have found the satisfaction that was promised. At the same time, many in our culture see sex as far more than simply an act of physical enjoyment. Sex is recognised as something powerful, even transcendent. Just think about some of the lyrics in our love songs. They describe sex as something almost spiritual. Bruno Mars. Never had much faith in love or miracles. Never want to put my heart on the line. But swimming in your water is something spiritual. I'm born again every time you spend the night. Because your sex takes me to paradise. Yeah, your sex takes me to paradise. The first pop song I ever learned the lyrics to was, and this is going to date me, was Eternal Flame by the Bangles. Do you even know that song? No, most people not. Okay. I remember sitting at my desk in my room with a tape recorder. Do you even know what that is? Rewind, play, listening, learning the lyrics, rewind, yeah. I could sing it to you, but I won't. Here's the first verse. Close your eyes, give me your hand, darling. Do you feel my heart beating? Do you understand? Do you feel the same? Am I only dreaming, or is this burning an eternal flame? Just think how many songs sing about love that will go on forever. I wasn't familiar with this one. Oh, need that picture if you don't know the Bangles. I wasn't familiar with this one by Dan Fogelberg, great name, but the lyrics are brilliant. Just listen to this. Longer than there have been fishes in the ocean, higher than any bird ever flew. Longer than there have been stars up in the heavens, I've been in love with you. And you think, really? Longer than there have been stars in the heavens? But when it comes to celebrating sexual romantic love, we easily slip into hyperbole and exaggerated poetry because we have this sense that there is something transcendent about it. Ernest Becker wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book in the 1970s called The Denial of Death. Becker was an atheist, and he says, effectively, now that we know that there's no God, now that we smart modern people have rejected that outdated idea, what are we going to do? What are we going to replace God with? Listen to what he says. Modern man still needed to feel heroic, to know that his life mattered in the grand scheme of things. He still had to merge himself with some higher, self-absorbing meaning. If he no longer had God, how was he to do this? He suggests one of the first ways that occurred to modern man was the romantic solution. The self-glorification that modern man needed in his innermost being, he now looked for in the love partner. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying we're now trying to get from sex and romantic love what we used to get from God. What is that? Well, it is that sense that Becker speaks of, that sense that our life matters, that we have worth. You can't give that to yourself. You can't just look at yourself and say, I'm great, I'm great, I'm great. You can't do that. You need a word from outside. Listen to one of our leading philosophers, Bridget Jones. In a diary entry, she says, I am an assured, receptive, responsive woman of substance. My sense of self comes not from other people, but from myself. That can't be right. And she's right, isn't she? Your sense of self can't come from yourself. You need someone outside of you to affirm you. Now, if a person that you don't particularly respect tells you you're great, well, that doesn't count for much. But if a person you do respect and admire says you're great, it has great power. And if a person you absolutely adores you, well, now you've got a sense of self. Becker is saying, in the past, we found our sense of self in God and His love for us. But now we've rejected God, and so we look to sex and romantic love to find that affirmation. That's how important sexual love has become in our culture. It is, possibly more than anything else, the thing that we put our hope in. Now, in the rest of this talk, I want to look at what the Bible has to say about sex and relationships. We're going to look at the passage that Grace read for us earlier, and what Jesus says about sex and marriage, and how that fits into what the whole Bible says on this subject. As I said before, the church has historically not been particularly good at presenting a positive view of sex and sexuality, and I want to try and do that briefly. I'm conscious many of you don't share this worldview, and there may be things that you find confusing in what I say, even offensive. What I'm asking is that for the next 10 minutes or so, you kind of step into the Christian worldview, kind of come into our house and have a look around. You may not agree with everything, but hopefully you'll at least be able to understand it a bit more and make sense of some of the things that you do find pride. Look at this quote. Those who hear not the music think the dancer's mad. I want to use that quote to apply to this and suggest that the music here is the Christian message and the dance is the Christian lifestyle in relation to sex. If you don't get the Christian message, then there'll be lots of things that you find confusing and bizarre about the Christian sexual ethic. And so my hope is that this little talk goes some way to getting you to hear the music. Firstly, we're going to look at God's vision for sex and marriage. We had that passage read from Mark 10, and here we find, a summary of Jesus' understanding on these things. Now, the context for what Jesus says is a question from the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day. They're asking about divorce, and they're probably trying to trick Jesus into saying something that they can use against him. In response, Jesus takes them back to God's original design for sex and for marriage. He quotes from Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right at the beginning of the Bible. Jesus says, if we're going to understand sex and relationships, then we need to understand the Maker's instructions. You see, God invented sex. God invented marriage. The Bible says that sex is good, really good. God invented it. I don't know if there are any engineers here, and I don't know if you're planning to kind of have a life of inventing things, but imagine that, being the person who invented sex. That's pretty awesome. God is not anti-sex, it is his design. But if he invented it, then we would do well to listen to what he says about it. So let me read to you again from Mark chapter 10, and verses 6 to 9. This is Jesus speaking. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. We learn from this that God's design for marriage is a permanent and exclusive union of a man and a woman. We're told that God is involved in joining a husband and wife together. So there is something sacred, something transcendent about marriage. The marriage relationship is characterized by two big things: commitment and intimacy. You see the idea of commitment when it says that a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. Literally, he will hold fast to his wife. There's no ambiguity about this relationship. There is a public leaving of the family of origin and a commitment to form a new family with his wife. Marriage is a relationship that's based on a promise, on a commitment. It's not about present feelings, but future commitments. In the marriage service, if you've ever been to one, you may have heard that the husband and wife, the bride and groom, make promises to each other. They don't just say, "I love you," they say, "I will love you," in better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts us. The marriage relationship is, in its essence, a relationship of commitment. And in that commitment, there is great security. That's certainly been my experience in marriage. Because my marriage with Corinne is not based on our changing feelings. And it's not conditional on me fulfilling her expectations. Marriage for us has not been free from difficulties, not at all. We faced some tough challenges and deep conflict. But the promises that we've made to each other mean that we've been able to work through those challenges. Marriage is a relationship of commitment. Secondly, it's a relationship of intimacy. In the account of creation in Genesis 1, after everything God makes, we're told, "And it was good." But then in chapter 2, we're told that something was not good. It was not good, we're told, for the man to be alone. Adam loves the animals, I assume, but they're not the companion that he needs. And so God takes a piece of the man and creates a woman. And in response, Adam sings the first love song. We don't have the tune, but the lyrics go like this. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. It's not particularly inspiring, is it? But, he probably had to come up with it on the spot. But what we learn from this, the fact of it not being good for the man to be alone, God creating the woman to be a companion, what we learn is that marriage at its heart is a relationship of deep friendship. It is a one flesh relationship. In other words, a relationship of complete unity. Not just physical unity, but relational, spiritual, emotional oneness. It is a relationship of radical self-giving. Again, in the marriage service, the partners say to each other, all that I am, I give to you, and all that I have, I share with you. After Adam's attempt at poetry, we're told about the first marriage, and then the author says, Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. When it says they were naked, it's not talking just about being physically naked, but personally naked. Completely open and vulnerable with one another. It's about letting the other person in fully. Letting the other person know you all the way. The fact that they were naked and unashamed presents, I think, this beautiful picture in which they were completely known and fully loved. Completely known and yet fully loved. And it's in this context, this relationship of commitment and intimacy, that sexual union finds its purpose. God designed sex, you see, to be far more than just an act of physical enjoyment, though it is that. Sex is God's ordained way of saying to another person, I belong permanently and exclusively to you. I belong wholly to you. I give myself to you fully. When you have sex and you get naked and vulnerable physically, you give yourself physically. You're united physically. In God's design, that is meant to be a symbol and a sign that you've given yourself fully. That you are united in every way. Legally, socially, economically, emotionally. In that context, sex is incredibly nurturing, unifying, strengthening to a relationship. It helps to deepen the unity more and more. And what that means is that if you want to have sex without the commitment and self-giving of marriage, then you're saying, I want to give you my body, but I don't want to give you myself. You're wanting to get physically naked and vulnerable without becoming vulnerable in all of life. You're wanting to use sex in a way that it was never intended to be used. And you're dishonoring this incredibly good and powerful thing that God has designed to provide deep nurture to a relationship. Now, I'm sure I've just offended half the room, but I hope you can at least see the Christian teaching on sex outside of marriage. It's not just a random repressive rule. Sex outside marriage is, if you like, a lie. It's using the thing that God designed to say, I'm wholly committed to you, even though you're not. The Christian view of sex and marriage is really high. I hope you can see it's really beautiful. But it's not ultimate. You know that elsewhere in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul gives similar teaching on sex and marriage, but then encourages people about the benefits of being single. And you think, how does that work? He presents this really high view of sex, and then he says, it's quite all right to live your life without it. Yeah, you can live a perfectly fulfilled life without sex. How can that be? Well, that brings us to the second point, God's ultimate vision for sex and marriage. Through the Bible, God describes himself again and again as a husband, and he describes his people as his bride. And I think that helps us to understand that God is not just a king, he's a spouse. It also helps us to understand God's heartache at our rejection of him. Our rejection of God and our pursuit of other things in place of him is described in the Bible as spiritual adultery. And God feels the betrayal of that. At the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus takes up this same imagery. He describes himself as the bridegroom. What we're being told through all of this is that human sex and human marriage are not ultimate. They are shadows. They're signs pointing to a greater reality. And that greater reality is the relationship between Jesus and his people. The Bible begins with a marriage, we've seen that. The Bible also ends with a marriage. In the final book of the Bible, Revelation, part of the way that the joy of eternity is described is as a wedding feast, a marriage, the joyful union of Jesus with his people. If you came to the Mark drama, you'll remember the scene. It's probably the scene that gets the most laughs, where a story is told about a woman who marries 7 brothers, one after the other, and each of them die in turn. And the religious leaders are again trying to trip Jesus up, and they ask him, Jesus in eternity at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since she was married to all 7? Jesus' response is that in the life to come, there won't be human marriage. But there will be a marriage, the ultimate marriage. What if the sense that we have that sex is something transcendent comes because it is pointing to something truly transcendent? What if all our longings for eternal love and relational fulfillment are there within us because we were actually created for a relationship of eternal love and fulfillment? What if all the fairy tale love stories of happily ever after are true? You see, the Christian message is a story. It's the story of an ultimate spouse who left his father and came to seek his bride. Jesus is the one who makes an ultimate commitment. He says, I have always loved you. He's the only one who can say he's loved you longer than there have been stars in the heavens. He says, I've always loved you, and he promises, I will always love you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. Jesus is a spouse who is utterly faithful. He'll never give us up. He'll never let us down. And Jesus is the one who invites us into a relationship of ultimate intimacy. You see, on the cross, Jesus Christ gave himself fully for you. On the cross, Jesus became truly vulnerable. He was literally stripped, naked, made vulnerable for you. And for those who trust in Jesus, there is a union with him. And those words, all that I am, I give to you, all that I have, I share with you, find their fulfillment. Jesus takes on himself all of our sin and shame, and he deals with it on the cross. And Jesus gives to us his perfect righteousness, so that we can stand forgiven and approved by God. Tim Keller says, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known but not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is life-changing. What we're being told is that sex and marriage is like a movie trailer. Our relationship with Jesus is the real thing. Look at this quote from author Christopher West. God made us as sexual beings, as men and women with a desire for union, precisely to tell the story of his love for us. In the biblical view, the fulfillment of love between the sexes is a great foreshadowing of something quite literally out of this world, the infinite bliss and ecstasy that awaits us in heaven. We don't experience the fullness of relationship with Jesus now. That will only be in eternity. But even the foretaste that we do get now is transformative. Yesterday afternoon, I met with a neighbouring pastor, and we spent some time in prayer. And as we were praying, my heart was flooded with an immense joy and incredible security, knowing that the Lord of the universe himself knows me completely, sees all my shame, yet loves me deeply and eternally. Now that is not my experience all the time, every day, but it is the reality. I'm conscious I'm talking about something profound, and I know I haven't done it justice. But let me say this in conclusion. When you know Jesus' love, it does change your life. It means that you can do marriage, you can commit yourself to someone fully, you can promise to love them freely because you aren't looking to them for your ultimate fulfillment. You have the inner resources from your relationship with Jesus. And it means that you can do singleness. You can even do celibacy, because human sex and romantic relationship is not the ultimate. It's just a shadow, just a trailer. And the reality will be so much better. Jesus says to each one of us, make me your one true love. Find yourself in me, and everything will be all right. I'm going to be around at the front if you'd like to talk afterwards and ask any questions. There'll be some other people here as well wearing blue jumpers. So please come forward if you'd like, or take the time afterwards to chat with the friend who brought you along. Thank you again for listening, and maybe see you tomorrow.